Hello and welcome to this webinar. This is the first in a series of 3 events where we officially launch the EBRD Business Reorganisation Assessment on business reorganisation and turnaround across the EBRD regions in Europe, Asia and Africa. My name is Jonathan Charles. I'm the Managing Director of Communications at the EBRD. Well, the coronavirus pandemic has dealt an unprecedented blow to many businesses around the world. While economic recovery is underway, it is uneven. And it is being disrupted, of course, by the continued spread of new COVID-19 variants. Indeed, according to the latest OECD estimates, lower income countries are at risk of being left behind, especially where vaccination rates are low. Over the past 2 years, many businesses have needed to restructure both operationally and financially. Other businesses have ceased to be viable. One of the EBRD's key priorities is to ensure this doesn't translate into insolvent liquidation procedures for a majority of businesses and further economic damage. The EBRD assessment aims to provide guidance on legislative gaps in insolvency and bankruptcy frameworks. It complements a number of debt restructuring and insolvency initiatives by the EBRD and other IFIs in response to the coronavirus pandemic, including, of course, our own Solidarity Framework 2.0. I'd encourage you to have a look at the results, which are publicly available at ebrd-restructuring.com. That's ebrd-restructuring.com. Today's discussion aims to give an overview of the main results and rankings of EBRD economies. It considers how supportive the legal and institutional frameworks are for business reorganisation within insolvency. We're going to begin this event shortly with an address by the EBRD's President, Odile Renaud-Basso. This will be followed by a short presentation by Catherine Bridge-Zoller, a Senior Counsel in the EBRD's Legal Transition Programme. And of course, there'll be some question and answers, a chance for you to take part, because the final part of today's session features a panel discussion between a number of distinguished internal and external speakers, with more opportunities then as well for Q&A. This event is being recorded for social media, so before we start, just a few pointers for those of you joining us on WebEx. Make sure you mute your microphones and keep your video off. That would help us a lot. You can put your questions to the panel in the chat function during the Q&A section at any point during the discussion, and we'll do our best to address them. And of course, please remember to introduce yourself when you post your question in the chat function. We'd definitely like to know who you are. Anyway, let's get underway. Without further ado, I'm going to pass the floor to Odile to say a few introductory words. Odile.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, this afternoon, to launch this EBRD's Business Reorganisation Assessment Report. It's, I believe, quite an innovative and comprehensive report on business reorganisation and turnaround across all 38 economies where the EBRD invests. And it provides guidance for legislators and policymakers in our regions who have been working very hard in the context of the COVID crisis to limit the economic damage on companies and businesses. And strong insolvency frameworks that support businesses as well as banks and investors are absolutely vital for a thriving market economy. I would like to highlight three key lessons of the report. The first one is the importance of increased transparency for all investors and parties to an insolvency process. Transparency is key to enhance market confidence and to build market confidence. The second lesson is the need for lighter hybrid procedures with less court involvement to help turn around underperforming businesses. It's good news that there are hybrid solutions in half the economies where EBRD invests. And the third lesson, I would say, is the need to simplify procedures for SMEs, the building blocks of our region's economies, which have been particularly hardly hit by the crisis. The economic crisis we've been living through has taught us that insolvency is not only about liquidation of failing businesses, but we need really to make all efforts to end the stigma around insolvency. It would make way for a recognition that every business may suffer financial difficulties at some stage, and most businesses deserve a chance to make a fresh start. As an assessment, we have ranked, as Jonathan was saying, economies' overall performance by how supportive their legal frameworks are for business reorganization within insolvency. And of course, we are fully aware that assessment rankings are never perfect or fully conclusive, but they can help signal areas for further improvement and reform. And it's really encouraging to see that some economies, such as Kosovo's, have developed a progressive model for business reorganization. So the idea is that through initiatives for the EBRD, through initiatives such as the Legal Transition Program, we support our economies in their effort to improve their investment climate. And I must say, the challenges they face with business reorganization, insolvency procedures are exactly the same all economies are facing. I've been working on this issue also in France, and it was the same challenges about turnaround, giving new chance for failing businesses and so forth. To continue this very important work for our countries of operation and for their development economic growth, we rely on the support of our donors. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your support in this respect. I would also like to acknowledge the dedication of our Legal Transition Program colleagues in the Office of the General Counsel and our resident office. Their contribution to this work has been, they have been at the core of this work. And this is their hard work which has made this report possible. So this report launched this week, which will include 3 events involving many of our partners, and we look forward to working with them to assist national authorities in further enhancing their insolvency frameworks. Thank you very much, and I hope the discussion will be enlightful and useful for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Odile, for joining us. Okay, let's go over to Catherine now, and Catherine, perhaps you could present some of the findings.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our launch of the EBRD Business Reorganization Assessment Report. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm the Senior Counsel working inside the EBRD's, or for the EBRD's Legal Transition Program, and I cover insolvency and financial restructuring. We're very honored to have today attendees at this webinar who are distinguished government officials in some of the economies where the EBRD operates. May I ask the team to share my slides? Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in my presentation today, I will provide first the background to the assessment. Second, I will discuss the methodology that I've developed together with Professor Olivares Caminal. And third, I will present the overall rankings or performance of EBRD economies. Finally, I will say some words about data transparency. Data transparency and the overall lack of data emerged as an issue in many of the economies when we carried out this assessment. I'm very happy to answer any questions that you may have at the end. And to ask a question, as Jonathan mentioned, you need to put your name and question in the chat box. So this assessment on insolvency and bankruptcy is part of the work that we do within the EBRD and the Legal Transition Program. And the aim of this program is about improving the legal framework and the investment climates in the economy where the EBRD invests. Assessments and research are a regular part of our work, and they provide a broad understanding of the many economies and jurisdictions where EBRD works. This assessment began in May 2020, and it was a direct response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was very clear early on that the pandemic and the restrictions introduced by governments would put tremendous pressure on businesses. This assessment is an insolvency sector assessment, and we use the term bankruptcy and insolvency interchangeably because it means different things in different economies. We are focused on the procedures for insolvent and financially distressed businesses, and these are the legal or the statutory procedures that give those businesses an opportunity to restructure their finances and their operations. They're often court supervised, not necessarily, and the debtor usually benefits from some form of protection from its creditors. We have not evaluated insolvent liquidation or winding up as part of this assessment. Next slide, please. So what are the key parts of our assessment? Well, there are three main components. The first is a cross-jurisdictional part, and this is then followed by separate profiles for each of the 40 jurisdictions and 38 economies. Finally, we have a series of annexes which contain more detailed research and background. Next slide, please. Here on this slide, you can see all the relevant assessment economies mapped out, which cover 3 continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. These economies include 12 EU member states. And I should mention that Cyprus was part of the assessment because it was a member and a country of operations when we launched the assessment, but it ceased to become an investing economy last year. And at the same time, the Czech Republic became an economy of operations again, but only for a limited period during the assessment, which is why we didn't initially include it within the scope. Next slide, please. 2 important sources of guidance for our assessment were the principles which you see here on this slide. I developed these in 2020 in consultation with other IFIs and members of Insol Europe, a professional association of insolvency specialists. Next slide, please. So this slide provides a visual overview of our assessment methodology. The starting point was developing an online questionnaire for all stakeholders with specialist knowledge of bankruptcy and insolvency. And we disseminated this to a targeted audience across the EBRD's networks. We did also make it publicly available for transparency reasons. And we're very grateful for all the support we received from our resident offices, from investment councils in 11 of the countries, and also external organizations such as the European Commission, which has been very active in the area of business reorganization, the International Development Law Organization, UNCITRAL, and our partners at Insol. So in parallel to running this questionnaire, our team carried out detailed legal research and we reviewed all of the national insolvency laws in all 40 jurisdictions. We collected in total 457 questionnaires within the EBRD region. So it's I think that's quite an impressive result given the fact it was quite technical. And we also collected 48 questionnaires outside of the EBRD regions. So we opened it up to really everyone. And the reason we did that was also out of interest and because it was useful for benchmarking. So the questionnaires you can see here is based on 5 different sections, and they generally follow the timeline of a business reorganization procedure. And they're all equally rated. The questionnaire for efficiency was also automatically scored, and we had to disregard a minority of questionnaires, approximately 30, because they were either inaccurate or incomplete. So the rankings that you will now see are calculated on this scoring per section, so the total score of all the sections of the questionnaire. And you'll see that the graphs that we will show provide a breakdown of what each economy achieved per section. We also decided during the course of the assessment to incorporate some additional points for data transparency. And there is an additional bonus of up to 10 points, which each economy was awarded for publishing comprehensive and easily accessible insolvency data. Separately, we also looked at 3 benchmarks or qualities that indicate the overall supportiveness of a country's legislation and general framework for business reorganization. These are the three you can see on the right of the slide. So flexibility, efficiency, and effectiveness. So these qualities don't affect the rankings, but they are another way of assessing a country's legal framework. Throughout the whole of this process, I would just like to stress we consulted as far as we could with both the private sector and the public sector. So we were able to form relationships with at least 2 partner law firms in each of the jurisdictions who helped us on a pro bono basis. But we also did 5 virtual country missions. So to Egypt, Serbia, Poland, Mongolia, and Ukraine, where we were able to cross-check our findings and interpretation. And we spoke to other IFIs, such as the World Bank, who were very active in this area, to get their impressions. So thank you very much to all of the national authorities and to the World Bank for supporting this consultation process. Next slide, please. So here you can see the overall results for all EBRD economies. As Adil mentioned, this is not conclusive or perfect, and it's based on respondent feedback. So the questionnaire itself was a mixture of factual questions about the extensiveness of the legislation, so what tools are available, but it was also about stakeholder perception. So please bear that in mind when looking at these results. The 4 top performers, as you can see, are Greece, Poland, Lithuania, and Romania. And they're perhaps all, unsurprisingly, EU member states. Now, EU member states have been under some pressure, or they've certainly been encouraged to really look at this area because they have had a new directive to transpose. This was a directive introduced in 2019 to support business reorganization called the Preventive Restructuring Directive. It's very positive, as we've mentioned, that in 5th place we see Kosovo, and also not far behind Moldova and Albania. So Kosovo, Moldova, and Albania have, in our view, quite progressive business legislation, and the most progressive that we could identify outside of the EU. All of the economies covered by the assessment look quite different. So it is difficult sometimes to compare all of these. Some have very simple and linear processes like Tajikistan and Mongolia, where really there is one procedure. But others like Poland and Uzbekistan have 4 or 5 procedures. Next slide, please. So as we've mentioned, a major finding of the assessment was the overall lack of insolvency data on reorganization type procedures. And in some countries, there was a total lack of insolvency data. And this is why we introduced the data transparency bonus. And you can see here on the right, the 5 criteria for data transparency that we developed internally at the EBRD. So our starting point really was that any economy needs to really think about centralizing their insolvency data and who is responsible for maintaining it. Usually this is the lead body or regulator of insolvency procedures. And the transparency element comes in because with the publication of that data, so making this data available as in real time as much as possible and up to date, easily accessible. Finally, we believe that the data is only really useful if it's sufficiently granular and shows a breakdown per procedure. And the idea here is that all economies that are transparent and publish comprehensive data are more likely to have invested in regulation and to have an active, developed insolvency system that's supportive of businesses and the wider economy. So data transparency is really important for more informed policy making, because without that, it's really hard to say, what effect a particular legislative amendment or new law has on the business sector. And it really is important for promoting market confidence. I should mention here that we conducted a short survey on non-performing loans as part of the assessment, and there's a very clear link between non-performing loans and insolvency systems. And investors want to know. They want to know what the insolvency system is like, how soon they may recover their money, and what they what their recoveries will be. So unfortunately, as you can see on this graph, 11 of the jurisdictions that we covered scored 0 points, where there really isn't, we couldn't identify any public reporting of insolvency data. And there were, on the positive note, six jurisdictions which scored 10 out of 10 for transparency of data on the face of it. And I think in some of these jurisdictions, it was really due to investing in things like an electronic insolvency register. So making that data readily available and transparent. Next slide, please. So just to conclude the presentation, this very brief overview, all of the material that we, all of the research and the material that we have from this assessment, we've made this publicly available, including the methodology and all the workings out, the scoring of per question. It's all on our website, ebrd-restructuring.com. And we really hope this will be useful for other organizations working in this area, for researchers in the field, and above all, for national authorities and policymakers. So I look forward to taking any questions that members of the audience may have, and look forward very much to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. And as Catherine said there, of course, put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll pick some of them up all the way through the next just under an hour. But of course, any particular questions at the moment for Catherine? I've got a couple of questions, Catherine. I mean, first of all, you launched this assessment during the second half of 2020. The pandemic was in full force. What effect did that pandemic and, of course, the government response to the pandemic have on that work?
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm just unmuting myself. Well, no, it's an interesting question. So during the pandemic, a number of national authorities introduced temporary amendments to their insolvency legislation. And a lot of them were about protecting businesses, making it a bit more difficult for creditors to file for insolvency. Now, we were aware of all of that as we were doing our assessment, but we were really focused on what permanent procedures and measures were in place within these legal frameworks to support business. So it was interesting that a few countries, such as Poland, actually incorporated some of these emergency measures into their domestic law, and we've covered all of that in the assessment. And it is a challenge always with insolvency law, because legislation is in flux. So even with this assessment and the rankings, I think it's important to bear in mind that that countries, since we carried out the questionnaire and collected all that data, countries have changed their insolvency laws. So there have been some really big reforms in countries like Georgia, and also in the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as in the EU, and as a result of this new preventive restructuring directive. But what we've done, what we were able to do, was to update all of the economy profiles on our website to make sure that that is a true and accurate snapshot of the legal framework. But people have to bear in mind when looking at the rankings that they may not reflect just the latest legislation.
I thought it was quite interesting. I don't know whether I read this correctly because the screen was a bit far away from me, but Kosovo looked as though it was low down on transparency, or almost no transparency, but quite high in the overall rankings.
I know. I think there. I mean, Kosovo has what I would describe as a really good, solid legal framework. So the legislation is comprehensive. It includes, as Odile mentioned, the hybrid procedures. Kosovo is also, I think, quite exemplary in having a tailored procedure for SMEs, and this is something that other organizations such as Ancestral have been looking at carefully. So I think Kosovo has great legislation, and now maybe data transparency could become the next focus for the regulator.
Okay, I didn't want to pick on one country, but I just thought that was very interesting. Moving on to another question. I mean, you mentioned non-performing loans there, and in parallel, you did this survey of MPLs, and there is a link between MPLs and the main thrust of what you were doing. Do you want to say a bit more about that? Because it is an interesting topic.
Thank you. So, yes, non-performing loans. Well, as some of you will know, the EBRD is very active in the policy dialogue and discussions around non-performing loans, and we work closely with central banks and regulators. And insolvency is what I would describe as just one of the possible routes for resolving those non-performing loans. So everyone needs, all banks and investors need these different avenues, and we were really interested in looking at whether there was a connection between the reorganization tools that were available and ease of resolving non-performing loans. But I have to say, we found that in the absolute majority of the jurisdictions that we covered, the respondents didn't think that the reorganization tools efficiently helped to resolve non-performing loans, and they had similar, in fact, they had even stronger, I think, reservations about the debt enforcement and security enforcement mechanisms available. So I think it indicates that that there's a lot of work still to be done by national authorities and regulators to make the insolvency system work better and help clean up non-performing loans in the banking sector.
So what about next steps then, Catherine? What are the most urgent things that need to be done in your mind after this, having looked at this study?
Thank you. I think the as we've mentioned, transparency. We'd like to know more. I think that it will help. It will help national authorities and regulators understand their insolvency systems better if they also understand, where the value is, where the value leakage is, what the recoveries are. If they are also focused more on, the timeliness of insolvency procedures, because it really is value destructive for a company to go through an extremely lengthy insolvency procedure. It should be a quick in and out. So I think focusing on getting that data is just essential. It's also really important, I think, insolvency to invest in capacity building. So insolvency is a specialist area. I mean, it's one where you really do need judges that are commercial law judges focused on business. You also need to have a thriving profession of insolvency practitioners that work on these reorganization plans and that can also provide advice to debtor businesses. And for that, you need to think really carefully about the whole ecosystem, how these people are remunerated, and try and really build into the framework some incentives for everyone, really, and to make sure that insolvency systems, are operate as smoothly as possible, and they maximize value. They don't lose value throughout the process.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. It's an interesting study. Well, we've got a great lineup of distinguished guests with us to provide their insights and reactions to this EBRD Business Reorganisation Assessment. I think we've made them sit there long enough. Let's introduce them. I think that would be quite good. First of all, Professor Beata Jaworczyk, the EBRD's Chief Economist, Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford. We also have with us Ramit Nagpal, the EBRD's Deputy General Counsel and responsible for the bank's legal transition programme. We're joined by Mahesh Uttamchandani, the Practice Manager for Financial Inclusion, Infrastructure and Access at the World Bank, with a long-standing background in insolvency and debt restructuring, and indeed a former member of the EBRD's legal transition team. And we are joined by Rodrigo Olivares Caminal, Professor in Banking and Finance Law at the Centre for Commercial Law Studies at Queen Mary University of London, and one of the co-authors of the assessment report, as you heard Catherine mentioning earlier. So let's turn the floor over to our guests so we can get some of their main takeaways from today's presentation and the assessment report. And again, a reminder, it is available for you to look at on ebrd-restructuring.com. Let's start with the big picture. And Beata, perhaps I could turn to you first of all. Set the scene for us and today's discussion by giving us an overview, perhaps, of the economic performance in the EBRD's regions.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everyone. Most of our countries of operations enjoyed quite a good rebound last year, but clouds are gathering on the horizon. Well, first of all, vaccination rates are relatively low, so that makes these countries vulnerable to COVID. Though on the positive side, we have not seen yet a decline in people's mobility during the current wave. And that's important because a 10% decline in mobility shaves off 2 percentage points of the GDP. Second, inflation has been on the rise and central banks have been responding in most places with increases of interest rates. And third, growth in Western Europe is slowing down, which does not augur well for exports. So in most places, performance this year is going to be weaker than last year's rebound. But so far, we have not seen an increase in non-performing loans and bankruptcies. And actually, if you look at the Eurostat data, we see that the number of bankruptcies in the new EU member states last year and in 2020 was lower than in the pre-pandemic times. And that's not surprising, given the measures Catherine mentioned. Many governments have introduced emergency measures that protect businesses from insolvencies. But of course, these measures are going to be withdrawn, and we are likely to see non-performing loans and businesses that will need restructuring. So I very much welcome this report, which is timely and can provide valuable advice to many of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Beata. Let me turn to you, Mahesh. What does all this mean for insolvency and non-performing loans?
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and congratulations to the EBRD team for a great report, and thank you for inviting me today. So I think there's a lot of mystery and uncertainty out there. It's probably important for us, those of us who try to make predictions, to be a little bit humble when we go back and look at the start of the pandemic, and the most widely accepted numbers were that insolvency cases would go up by 35% over 2 years. And as Beata rightly pointed out, that didn't materialize. So the question is sort of why didn't that happen, and what does that tell us about the future? And I think on the why, Catherine alluded to this in her presentation, there's been $10 trillion globally of stimulus that might have staved off some of these increased insolvencies. But it's also important to note that when we look at previous crises, the time lag between the peak of the crisis and the peak of the non-performing loans and insolvencies that follow it is quite long. So in the global financial crisis, this was about 13 quarters in advanced economies and about 11 quarters in emerging markets. So by that metric, we may still be feeling the after effects of the crisis, in a few quarters from now, and we may see the rise in the number of cases. But I think the other thing to look at is that across the world, probably about 155 countries engaged in some kind of reform relating to insolvency and debt repayment in 2020. And when we surveyed a number of those countries, what we found was that about 80% of the countries that had engaged in some kind of reform had put in measures to delay the repayment of overdue loans or had put in measures that limit the ability of a creditor to commence an insolvency proceeding. And as these measures begin to recede, we may be left with a sort of pent up stock of, loans that might not be officially non-performing, but might be troubled or underperforming or on the cusp of becoming non-performing. And there we are, going to see a potential rise in the number of cases. And I should say in Europe in particular, while there was not an increase in non-performing loans, in the existing stock of non-performing loans going into the pandemic, there was a decrease in asset quality of those loans. So they moved from sort of tier 1 non-performing to tier 2 non-performing. So there is some element of deterioration here that we have to keep an eye on, and that coupled with the withdrawal of economic support, the receding of the legal forbearance, might produce a sort of perfect storm of distress.
Thank you very much indeed, Mahesh. Ramit, let me turn to you. How relevant are insolvency systems and indeed insolvency reform for the bank's activities, for the EBRD's activity?
Thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a very broad question, Jonathan, and then there are various elements to this. Let me say this. Let me start by saying that EBRD aims to promote an investor-friendly environment in all our countries of operation. We do this in furtherance of a charter mandate, which is to foster transition towards market-oriented economies. And one of the factors that makes a country investor-friendly is the shared understanding of a system that kicks in the event of financial distress. So helping our countries of operations build robust insolvency systems, which provide efficient options to reorganize, and not just for liquidation, is crucial to banks' activities. We also know that countries with good insolvency frameworks and systems are better placed to weather storms and stabilize after a financial crisis, as opposed to those countries who don't. So insolvency law reform is and should be in every country's economic recovery toolkit. I saw this personally play out during my time in Asia post 97-98, when the countries there were battered by the Asian financial crisis. So, there's another element to it that EBRD is both a lender and an equity investor in the region. And this puts us in a unique position from a policy perspective to look at insolvency both from a creditor and a shareholder point of view. Lastly, insolvency has been one of the pillars of our legal transition program. Previously, as Catherine mentioned, we had come out with core principles of an effective insolvency system and also insolvency office holder principles. So I would say this area continues to be very relevant and important for us. Jonathan.
Thank you very much indeed, Ramit. Rodrigo, let me turn to you. When you see reform taking place in countries at the moment, are there any obvious trends or priorities that you can identify in national legal reforms at present in this area?
Jonathan, thank you for the question. I think that probably to be fair in my answer, I think that probably we need to split the question in two parts. I mean, there has been a hurricane of reforms triggered as a result of the pandemic, which is basically that's why I think that basically immediately what we are seeing now is a digital revolution, and I think that basically that was a long due change that the pandemic has accelerated, and I think that that's here to stay and has proved very efficient. I think that it has been demonstrated how practical it is, how time can be saved, and that definitely that was an unavoidable change that was accelerated exponentially by the pandemic, and also a lot of emergency legislation. That emergency legislation was in place to trigger, to deal with something that was triggered from the night to the morning, a sudden stop of cash flows. And these were very profitable businesses that out of the sudden cash flow stopped. So there was the need for this kind of legal bazooka to cope with this extraordinary situation. Now is how we start undoing that and looking forward, and that's where probably we will probably catch up with some of the reforms that were brewing prior to, which is one of the aspects that has been mentioned by Catherine before, which has to do with specialized courts and support of specialists with a solid insolvency practice. That would say probably one of them. And the other one is one that, again, I think that the pandemic has brought our attention into, which is the small and medium enterprises. They insolvency laws usually are drafted and applied by big corporations, where in reality more than 90% of the business operating in any given economy are. And when I say small and medium, I try to cover all the possibilities from nano, micro, small, and medium enterprises. And the reality is that due to the hardship on the whole of the society and probably on the most vulnerable ones, I think that basically attention has refocused on small and medium enterprises.
Thank you very much indeed, Rodrigo. By the way, if you're watching this and you want to ask a question, put it in the Q&A function, or you want to comment and we'll pick up some of those. We've got lots of questions of our own, but if you want to add anything, please do. Let's move on to another area now, which is transparency and digitalization. And we've already heard of the importance of transparency a few times in the last few minutes. And one of the issues obviously highlighted in the assessment report is the lack of transparency and availability of insolvency data in some countries. So I'd like to ask each of our panelists to comment on the importance of data transparency and digitalization from their own perspectives. Beata, perhaps I could start with you on how you see this.
Thank you, Jonathan. So digitalization lowers the cost of obtaining information. And in one of our transition reports, we showed that rollout of 3G technologies, which gave people access to data on their mobile phones, made people more critical of their governments, right? Consistent with the access to information story. But that was only true in countries where internet was not censored. So digitalization does not help if governments do not publish information, do not release information. Now, digitalization leads to innovations such as fintech, which poses new challenges. There is a need for consumer protection, for new ways of protecting consumers, because if it's very easy to obtain credit from a fintech firm, it's very easy for a consumer to enter a debt spiral. There is a need perhaps for publishing or keeping track of data on fintech lending to firms and having some sort of registries of that. So certainly there is need for regulatory catch-up that's created by digitalization, for new data collection, and for disclosure of more data. And note that, as Catherine alluded, providing such information has cross-border effects. International trade is risky, and it's particularly risky if you are trading with a country that's in a turmoil. So if you can get access to information on whether or not your business partner is going through an insolvency procedure, that's incredibly valuable. Similarly, if foreign investors know the exit costs, they know what would happen in the case that they are not successful, that may increase the chances that they invest in the first place. So better data, better legislation, not good just for a country, but also for other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. That's very clear. Mahesh, your view of this?
I fully agree with Beata, and I think the way fintech is changing the way all finance is provided makes the data issue even more acute. So during the pandemic, one of the things we saw is that women-owned businesses were more likely to suffer distress than male-owned businesses. And women-owned businesses were less likely to access government support programs, although they were fully available to them, than male-owned businesses. So in some ways, the pandemic has been very regressive from a gender inclusion standpoint, but very few countries collect effective insolvency data, and even fewer collect gender disaggregated insolvency data. So we don't know, for example, how many more male-owned business or how many more women-owned businesses are filing for insolvency than male-owned businesses. And I think from a policymaker perspective, that is a problem because there's the old cliche that what gets measured gets done. And if one of your objectives is to understand how policies can be put in place to increase women's economic empowerment, then you need to understand where the pain points are for women. And I would say insolvency is one of them. And it's hard to make policy that is uninformed by that data. The other thing I'll say, just on the consumer protection point, which I think is really important, is we have to look at two sides of this coin. So during the pandemic, there were about 150 million new people worldwide given access to a financial service for the very first time, typically done through some kind of digital transfer from their government of a social or emergency payment. So that's great news. That's 150 million people connected to the financial system that previously weren't connected. They got their payments in some cases, overnight or immediately. But Beata is exactly right that we are then exposing these people to potentially predatory and other financial services for which they might not be protected. And we've already seen evidence that lending platforms that use these digital platforms tend to have higher rates of non-performing loans, higher interest rates, higher rates of failed repayment. So I think that it's this constant balance between innovation and managing the risk that policymakers need to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Mahesh. Ramit, it's quite interesting, all of this, isn't it, from the way we view things as a bank. If I think, for example, about transparency and digitalization, we have long argued as an institution, it's very important in the fight against corruption in countries. We do see countries that for services go down a transparency and digitalization route, have less petty corruption, and that's up. But now we're seeing this potential benefit in this area we're talking about today.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. That this is always a debate, and there are arguments on both sides here, Jonathan. Yes, clearly transparency and digitalization are linked, but it has to be backed up by a commitment to transparency. I mean, you can digitalize and feed it with junk, but the point is the junk will come out and you would be exposed. So we do feel that digitalization, the desire to digitalize, pushes the levels of transparency in any particular country clearly. For example, an investor finds it easier to make a solvency check on a counterparty when the data is available digitally. Systems have become more transparent, which is indicator of a good governance, and it inspires investor confidence. But there are arguments both which comes first. I do believe the commitment to transparency comes first, and digitalization is a tool, and we should be pushing it aggressively there. As far as EBRD is concerned, yes, it's a strategic theme for us under our strategic capital framework. In our legal transition program, we've been working on digital projects for some time now. For example, in Ukraine, we contributed to development of an electronic platform for sale of non-performing loans. We have done some digital projects in the area of public procurement. We are currently working with the insolvency regulator in Serbia on the digital systems to enhance the reporting systems. We're also supporting alternative means of financing like crowdfunding, technologies like blockchain. Whole idea is to introduce efficiency and transparency and good governance. And it's there that the assessment has shown that the digitalization initiatives are growing across the region as well, including in insolvency and court management systems, especially true in the EU member states, where EU insolvency regulation and the recent restructuring directive has come out. We hope that this positive development will have spillover effects for the non-EU economies in the region as well, Jonathan. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much indeed. And Rodrigo, I give you the last word in this section.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that let's start with transparency. Transparency is something that transcends boundaries, and I think that goes beyond any of the distinction between economies or jurisdictions. It's a common good that serves a greater purpose. I mean, if we look at this from Beata's macro point of view, basically it has to do with global stability. We look at this from a more domestic point of view. I will look probably even narrower. I will look at the angle of specific company. And I think that basically transparency, and that's why in the report we gave such an important standing to the amount of available information, because that is quintessential to not only reassure the purpose of any reorganization, but also for the greater good of stakeholders in any of these reorganization procedures. And also it facilitates the resolution for the debtor and also the recovery or also the resolution for the creditor. So basically, I think that transparency is something that it is at the heart of, I would say, probably not just insolvency law, but I say at the heart of law and society in general. And apologies if I'm becoming a little bit too romantic with the concept of transparency, but I think that basically that is what transparency is all about. On digitalization, I think that linking this specifically to what the report was about, I think that one of the greatest deficiencies spotted across all regions has to do with expediency and how fast are things resolved. And I think that digitalization is at the core of assisting in solving that particular aspect, in the sense that it will allow not just communication, but decisions and resolutions and steps to be adopted in a faster and even more economic fashion. And also it will allow to assist in solving backlogs and long-lasting procedures that are sometimes delayed in an unnecessary fashion. And the issue of expediency that is assisted by the issue of digitalization and technology also fits into two of the benchmarks that have been used in the report, which are flexibility and efficiency. So I think that this is one of those areas that cut across pretty much most of what we have done, if not all of what we have done in the report.
Rodrigo, thank you very much. We'll allow you to have romance about transparency. February is a very romantic month. We're not far away from Valentine's Day, so I think that's permitted. Let's step back a little bit again. You know, this assessment report was published earlier this month, provides a very detailed overview of the rescue tools available in EBRD countries of operations. But what more needs to be done? I wonder about your overall views on the report. Ramit, let me start with you. You know, what else do you think the EBRD, other MDBs, IFIs, I mean, you've been in another MDB before coming to us. You were in the Asian Development Bank. What more do you think can be done? What is the role of the international financial institutions in this area? You're muted, I'm afraid, Ramit.
Apologies. Thanks, Jonathan. It's a common old habit. We have the mute while you're still talking. But this is a fascinating report. I don't confess to have read all 104 pages, but I probably read about 70, 80 pages, and I was overwhelmed. Given the data challenges and to put something like this together at this level of comprehensiveness was pretty amazing for me. You know, it's a useful report, not just for the banking teams and the legal teams of the bank, but also for all our countries of operation and the policymakers who are looking at this report. I think it gives a clear idea of what the gaps are, what the deficiencies are, what they need to work on. They get to see the best practices in the region and beyond. We as in the legal transition team have a clear idea. We do our research and we are there to help our countries of transition to address those gaps, also maybe help them improve their ratings, but that's a separate matter. But essentially, we are there working with all the other multilaterals, IMF, World Bank, and ADB in the region. So assessments are always a starting point, Jonathan, and they're never conclusive. It's a tool to start working on your gaps, which will all help you in the time of crisis and also build investor confidence. There's still a lot of work to be done, and we clearly see that happening. So much more to be done. I certainly look forward to working with insolvency regulators in other countries, and work on projects like we did in Serbia on digitalization project. We could work with national authorities on other opportunities for reorganization and help in business rescue plans there. So there's a lot to be done there, Jonathan. Plenty to think about.
Thank you very much, Ramit. By the way, there are a few audience questions that have come in. We'll be tackling those in a few minutes. If you'd like to put one in the Q&A box. We would love to hear from you. Mahesh, let me turn to you. There is a complimentary report coming out imminently from the World Bank, which is the World Development Report, out in February. This month's going to focus on finance for an equitable recovery. How does that fit into the overall picture?
I mean, I think the WDR, which is one of our flagship publications, is for the first time going to have a dedicated chapter on insolvency, which I think underscores, Jonathan, how important this topic is and how timely the EBRD's report is. And I think the conclusions from the EBRD's report, to me, are much more informative and exciting than even getting into the details of the sort of rankings. I think some of the conclusions, particularly around the importance of hybrid procedures. So these are the procedures that might start out of court and end up in court, or start in court, then go out, then come back in. I think this is critical. I think the importance of new financing and having the rules in place that enable priority financing to come to troubled entities. These kinds of conclusions in the report are going to help countries design policy, which ultimately I think is what we're all after, at least from a IFI perspective, which is to help countries design policies that are going to promote growth, limit the loss of jobs if there is an economic downturn, and limit the loss of value or value destruction in a downturn. So it's going to be very timely and very helpful as we go forward.
Thank you very much. And Beata, of course, the EBRD has its own transition report out later this year. Do you think there's something that cross-cuts that from this sort of study?
Absolutely. After every crisis, we face the challenge of how to free resources from insolvent firms so that these resources can be put to a more productive use. We face the challenge of how to prevent zombie firms from surviving, from sort of lingering. And that's why, there's the need for these clear and transparent rules for business reorganization. But as we showed in the latest report, and as we will continue doing in the new reports, now we will need these insolvency rules because of the big structural changes our economies are facing. Take digitalization. We've seen that digitally intensive sectors in our countries of operations have created much more employment than other sectors. That's already a reflection of the structural change. More changes are to come. Our countries are as exposed to automation and our AI-based automation as Western Europe. And these big structural changes create winners and losers. And sadly, losers will need to exit so that resources are freed up. So looking into the future, having very good, transparent, efficient legislation that facilitates this process will be more important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you, Beata. And Rodrigo, let me turn to you. You've got all this information, of course, in this assessment and loads of data. How does that help you in academia? You're muted as well, Rodrigo. I'm sorry to tell you.
Sorry, Jonathan, 2 years into the pandemic and we still make the same mistakes. Jonathan,
let's do that.
Jonathan, I think it's not just academia. I think in general, when I was listening to Mahesh, I was looking to my reaction button to give him the clapping hands, because really the issue here is some of the conclusions of this report are really extremely relevant. And on this, building on the question and circling to come back to your original question, is I think that the report what has as for me, one of the most impactful elements of it or aspects of it is the issue, because it not only looks at the extensiveness, which is analyzing the black letter, but also the effectiveness, which is the perception of the stakeholder use of the actual insolvency processes in each of the economies / jurisdictions. And I think that that's very valuable, because this is a bit which is you are talking about academia. Academia can read the law, they can look into the black letter, but they cannot fill in that vacuum of the perception. And I think that that's extremely valuable. And for me, the main takeaway that you can get from this, both for academia, as you're asking, but basically for a wider audience, is the issue that this provides a digested identification of what are the main, what will be kind of a wish list of ideal tools to have in an insolvency law, and this will allow any policymaker in any of these, not just this economy, but I mean, because there's also a section where there's a comparison with benchmarks using the US, France, Germany, the UK, and even on the SME section, there are references to other jurisdictions that have been very active lately, like South Korea, Australia, other jurisdictions, and even some other economies who have had a regime for small, medium enterprises from before, like, for example, Argentina. And Jonathan, the whole idea here is that this agenda for reform is very valuable, but you don't need to necessarily see this as an agenda for reform. You see kind of, this is my wish list. This is what I need to have a state-of-the-art, modern insolvency law, and that you can use to quickly cross-check what do you have and what is missing, if you think that anything is missing.
Thank you very much indeed, Rodrigo. I'll tell you what, let's come now to those audience questions. We've had a couple, which I think we've got time to look at. The first is from Maxim Lavorsky, and the question is, there's the overall EBRD assessment ranking that includes the data transparency factor and that extra 10 points. However, there's also a ranking that excludes the data transparency factor. Any specific reason behind this division of two scoring methods? What scoring methodology should policymakers prioritize in the reform process, in your opinion? Maybe Catherine, you better have a first crack at this one, and then maybe Rodrigo.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think definitely the ranking with data transparency. What we did in the report was also to show how countries performed without this additional 10 bonus points. And then also with, we are very much focused on what the framework looks like with data transparency. And the assessment report also, as I mentioned, looks at scoring through 3 benchmarks, so of effectiveness, flexibility, and efficiency. So I think it's really, I mean, this was a massive assessment, a lot of data, and what we've done in the report is tried to set out different ways that policymakers can really interpret that data. You know, if they're really focused on efficiency, they might want to look very carefully at that benchmark and which aspects, you know, how they performed and which aspects might need improvement. Thank you.
Rodrigo.
Jonathan, seriously, I don't have much more to add to that. I will just reinforce what Catherine says, definitely with data transparency. And I would be probably extremely pragmatic in the sense that sometimes reforming insolvency law might prove slightly more difficult, but there's almost no reason whatsoever to oppose to greater transparency. And if you want to, if probably embarking on an insolvency law reform might be slightly more time consuming, doing between inverted commas, a quick fix on transparency, you know that basically can put you in a completely different level. And on top, and that's, I think, what we try to showcase with the 2D aggregated rankings, and particularly for those countries that score the least on the data transparency factors.
Rodrigo, thank you. And we've had another question, actually. Data transparency is clearly a hot topic. Question from Andres Federica Martinez for Catherine and Rodrigo. He says, please could you elaborate a bit further on what parameters are considered when assessing data transparency? Because, Andres Federica Martinez notes that Belarus comes as best performer and wonders how that's possible. Catherine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well, I think it's one of 6 best performers, and I did qualify also by saying on the face of it, because we really are looking at quite a criteria that were easily easy for us to assess here in London. So we looked objectively at whether there was a form of centralization of insolvency data and whether it was maintained by an official authority or body, and that is the case in Belarus. If the data is comprehensive, so if it included all types of insolvency procedures, and if it was available, which on the face of it was, we looked also at whether it was whether the published data was updated regularly, which it was in all of these 6 countries, and by regular we meant at least every year, but we were very encouraged to see that a number of countries really had sort of almost real-time data. We looked at how, whether it was aggregated per country, so you could have a general overview. So in Belarus and Greece, to know the exact numbers of the procedures, and also we looked at disaggregation again, so there's a proper split. So these were, I mean, maybe in the future we might set our data transparency criteria even higher. As I mentioned, it's very important for investors to know how much they could recover in an insolvency procedure. So authorities and organizations, international organizations like the European Commission are also really interested in this and in tracking recoveries, also tracking the speed of insolvency procedures, as mentioned by Rodrigo. So this is the first time we've introduced this into our insolvency assessments, and we focused on really those criteria that we could objectively verify here in London. So thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Rodrigo, do you want to add anything to that?
Very quickly, Jonathan, I don't want to get over technical, but pinpoint Andres to the annex number 3 of the report. He will find there that what we construed for purpose of the data transparency factor is a matrix that has 5 indicators, and each indicator, or under each indicator, you can score a maximum of 2. So basically, the possible scoring were 0, 1, and 2 under each indicator. So 2 times 5, that gives you the maximum points that you were able to score that were out of 10. And based on each jurisdiction, based on what Catherine was making reference to, whether periodicity of publication of the information, whether it was aggregated or deaggregated, and digital available or not, etc. There were different variables, and those were in this scale where you can score a maximum of 10 points.
Yeah, and
thank you very much. Yes, sorry, Catherine.
Just to add to that, what we also did when I was going through this is we did quite a bit of research into this. So we've put in this Annex 3 all the links to available country data. So if you're interested, you can go take a look. It's also in our economy profiles. So we've published really what we can, and we've explained also in this annex the reasons why countries scored as they did, and I hope that's quite sort of comprehensive. And we did adopt a very uniform approach across all economies.
So let's check out Annex 3. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. Thank you very much, by the way, to our panel, to Ramit, to Mahesh, to Rodrigo, to Beata, and to Odile, who joined us. Thank you for all of that input. It's probably worth concluding before we finish that the silver lining of this COVID-19 pandemic, if there is such a thing as a silver lining in these terrible circumstances, is that it's provided a unique opportunity to modernize, digitalize, and to introduce reforms that might otherwise have been delayed for quite some time, another decade or so. It's also reduced some of the negative stigma around insolvency and financial distress because many businesses have needed to restructure. Our business reorganization assessment report provides that up-to-date map of reorganization procedures and legal systems across the EBRD regions. It helps the EBRD, other IFIs and investors assess the risk of investing in an economy and what rescue options are available if an investment gets into difficulties. But any risk assessment, of course, needs to be based on proper and transparent access to information and data. That's why our discussion today, so much of it has placed so much emphasis on the need for transparency and digitalization, which obviously can help our economies to achieve that greater effectiveness. And do remember the results of our assessment and the economy profiles are available on our website, ebrd-restructuring.com. Before we go, I'd like to remind you there are 2 further events in this series this week. You can join us tomorrow, Wednesday at 2 o'clock GMT, to hear about current trends and reform priorities. We'll look further at best practices and the areas in which national authorities should focus. And then you can join us on Thursday at 12 midday GMT to learn about regional perspectives and next steps. We'll explore the assessment results from a regional angle and the broader policy lens. Many thanks to all of you for being with us. Many thanks again to our panel. Goodbye.